Hello, everyone, and happy Thursday. Welcome to Something to Talk About Live. My name is Jamie Hinkle. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm the Learning and Inclusion Manager at pflagnation.al. We're really happy to have you here today, and I would love to see your comments and questions on whatever platform you are joining us from. But just like always, I'm going to bring in Jean Marie Nevada to host today's conversation. Hi, Jean Marie.
Hey, Jamie, how's it going?
Pretty good. How are you?
I'm good. We are making it through the fall, heading towards the holidays. I'm kind of getting excited, even though I live in the desert where the season never changes, it feels like.
I mean, it is starting to feel like fall here for real, and I'm getting the last of my tomatoes to finally turn red, so that's exciting.
It is, and it's something that makes you happy, which I enjoy.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to be talking about all of those things that make us happy and those challenges today. So we will see you a little bit later, Jamie. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Hey, everybody. My name is Jean Marie Nevada. I'm the Director of Learning and Inclusion at PFLAG National. My pronouns are she and her, or if you use Spanish, ella. Every single week, we get together to talk about something related to LGBTQ equality and inclusion and issues. And this week, we are talking about mental health, particularly for Gen Z. So let me kind of put a little frame around our conversation today. So Monday, October 10th was World Mental Health Day, and October 19th, which is the third, for this year, it's the third Wednesday in October, we always observe International Pronouns Day. So we definitely have these different observances very much in front of mind when we came across some fantastic research from our colleagues at Springtide Research. So they just published a new report called Mental Health and Gen Z, What Educators Need to Know. And it is an amazing report. We have the link for you online so that way you can download that. We also have an article that we thought gave the report some interesting context too. And so if you're reading this week's article, we have something from the Philadelphia Inquirer by Una Gooden-Smith about Bucks County's queer prom and why it's important and some of the challenges that it sometimes faces. So definitely check out the report, check out this week's article, but we want to talk about some of the findings in that report. And let me just give you a couple of the numbers that really jumped out for me. 34% of respondents in this report said that they are not flourishing right now. 34% of a generation not flourishing when it came to mental health. 57% say that they've experienced trauma in one way or another. And one of the things that I really loved about this report was that data was collected in a binary way, male, female, but also non-binary respondents too. And one of the data points that got me was that 56% of non-binary respondents said that they feel lonely at school most or all of the time. So the report covers what is happening, but even more importantly, it covers a real switch in how educators, supporters, and even families should be approaching this conversation and this issue. But I'm not here to just tell you what's in the report. I want to introduce our guest today. So we have the head of community engagement for Springtide Research Institute, Marta Abuwaji.
Hello, nice to see you today, Jean Marie.
Hey, Marta, it is so good to see you. And I'm so excited that you're here because this research made me get very jumpy because it was just so well done and it was just such an eye-opener. So thank you for being here.
I'm so glad you've been able to dig into that latest report, and we're thrilled to be in conversation with PFLAG today. Have had so much respect for the work you're doing and hope we can have a really rich conversation.
Oh, I think we will. I have so many questions for you. So before we get into the report, which I want to do, could you just tell people a little bit about Springtide Research Institute for people who may not be familiar?
Yeah, so Springtide is a sociological research institute. So we're really curious about how organizations and institutions and groups work and also how they can change to best support young people. So we study youth and young adults between ages 13 to 25, which right now lines up with Generation Z. And we want to understand the ways that they find meaning in the world, community, identity. Those are some of the cornerstone topics we're always going to be curious about, but all of 2022 and even extending into 2023, we're specifically focused on the mental health experiences of young people and the ways that different people and groups can support Gen Z. So this current report that you're referencing today is our Mental Health and Gen Z what educators need to know report, but we also have one releasing very shortly. That's what faith leaders can do. We have another one that'll be coming about what parents can do, what workplaces and employers can do. So we want to understand all these different settings to allow young people to really flourish in their mental health. Because like that statistic you gave at the beginning, a third of young people have told us they simply aren't flourishing.
Yeah, I will admit to you that I sort of went into reading it knowing that there were a lot of challenges out there. I was actually shocked to realize how deep they ran and how deep they ran as we looked into particular identities in terms of both race and gender. So the first line of the report, literally right in the introduction, establishes a pretty grim reality. I'm just going to read it. The sentence says, the mental health crisis among young people has reached epidemic proportions. It goes on to then note that major medical and professional groups like American Academy of Pediatrics have dubbed this a public health emergency. So 2 questions about this. The first one, what are some of the indicators that you see that make this point, that we're not just kind of being extreme and trying to get attention on this? And is this about the pandemic or is this about something much bigger?
Well, like you referenced, there are major, research institutions beyond our work that are telling us that this is a crisis. And this was existing before the pandemic, but it's been exacerbated by the pandemic. So, you can look to the US Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy. He has done a whole focus on youth mental health. And one of our research advisors serves specifically on the Surgeon General's team for loneliness and disconnection, which that's what we were studying before the pandemic. Springtide did a report specifically looking at young people's experiences of loneliness because Gen Z is the loneliest generation that's ever existed. So often we think about seniors and older folks experiencing loneliness, and it's not to discount those real experiences, but it surprises a lot of people to know that youth and young adults who we see as being maybe hyper connected, also feeling extremely disconnected and really isolated when it comes to social isolation and loneliness. So, I mean, these are preconditions that have been exacerbated. When we look at all the disruptions that have come through the pandemic, especially when you think about teens and young professionals and students, where it's like, you're on campus, you're off campus, you're doing virtual learning, you're maybe remote working rather than in a corporate or office setting. So many things have started and stopped. And then you think about so many other social factors, whether it's racism, everything that has come through different major elections in the last few years, homophobia, all the current issues with trying to change school curriculum and banning books. The issues pile up. Global warming, like so much where young people are saying, my mental health is not okay. And there's a lot of contributing factors.
I think that's so fascinating. I also think the point that most people would assume this generation is more connected and less lonely. And it really does kind of fly in the face of a lot of the assumptions. And yet I think as you start to layer on all of these experiences that young people are having, it becomes pretty scary. I mean, I myself sort of watched people I know who had kids, especially, seniors in high school who went through senior years without all of those connections that so many of us we look back on their touchstone points. Yeah. It seems so simple, but it's not just that. It's
prom, graduations. Yeah, you're right. So many of those milestone moments that were taken or reimagined. And, they've been reimagined in a lot of beautiful, meaningful ways. There's lots of opportunities we see for creative connection and relationship building in maybe different modalities, but the crisis is real. But all of our research, we're always trying to make it highly actionable in ways that you can respond. We don't want to just give research that's like, so this is really worrisome. What do? We want to turn and offer tips that are applied in sociology and social research to make trusted adults feel equipped to do something about this crisis.
And that was actually one of the things that, and we were talking right before we started the show, that really got my attention very fast when I cracked open the report and started reading. So one of the biggest points that's made is the researchers are saying the responsibility for maintaining or for establishing flourishing mental health has always been placed on the individual. In other words, go seek therapy, go seek counseling, get into a support group, find support. So a teen may be told, go seek treatment for anxiety. But this model is not helpful. Can you talk about how that unfolds in the report? Because I think it is such a fascinating, and it's the right point that we haven't been talking about.
Well, I mean, this is why our commitment to doing mental health focus in all of our research this year and beyond is because we don't want just crisis intervention. We see the need for crisis intervention. We're not saying eliminate that. But if that is the only solution or the only option, we're missing a big opportunity to not even have to get to that point for a lot of people. So why are we putting the onus over and over again on the individual, like you said, to, hey, figure it out, find that help, get that help? Why can't we just look at maybe there's something going on that we could be changing systems to operate differently, to be creating more mental health friendly environments in a number of different settings. But today I know we're going to be focusing in on schools, and I've worked in public schools. I love some of the conversations I've had in school hallways and now extending into our research with students who are really demanding that this mental health issue is addressed. That in our qualitative interviews, we hear this louder than any other issue, that young people are saying, listen, like, this is a change that needs to happen in my school across institutions. So it's not just that we're recommending this as sociologists and researchers, we're directly quoting young people who are demanding this change.
There's one quote, I think it's from a young woman in the study, who said something about, this isn't about bringing a therapy dog to the library for us to pet. It really stuck with me because I thought there are so many of, I think, these well-intentioned,
of course,
things that people are doing. And I'm not saying the therapy dog isn't helpful, but it can't be the totality of the response that we're having, especially when these issues are so persistent and so much deeper. I mean, I just take school shootings, for example, by itself, and how that can unnerve. So one of the things that we've talked about a lot on the show, and one of the things that we really think is important to discuss is the stigma around mental health issues and even having these conversations. So we are talking about it more. I mean, I think if you look out there, there's, especially during the pandemic, suddenly everyone was talking about self-care, for example. Mm-hmm. So the conversations are getting bigger and more frequent, and yet we are still seeing things turning more negative. The outcomes are actually more negative. So the report gets into sort of the ineffectiveness of what we've been doing. So could you talk a little bit about what a long-term example of a solution would look like versus a more short-term one, to give people an idea of where we're going?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that so many examples are, or so many solutions are well-intentioned, but young people are telling us those are a lot more performative. Like, thanks, but I need more than 5 minutes of petting a dog in the library. And so we're really looking at what is happening on a policy level and what are young people seeing day to day in their lives. So, I mean, on a large policy level, we see a lot of money and focus from the Biden administration going to get more school counselors into schools. I don't think that's a bad thing at all. I think that's tremendous to get more counselors. But there has to be more than just more bodies in schools, because we already hear from students and young people that there's often low trust or low feelings of safety and connection with the supports that are already in place.
Yeah.
So, often there's a focus on let's train and equip more peer-to-peer supports. And I also love that, except we have to make sure that isn't still passing the buck to young people to support their own peers, that the responsibility still needs to be on these systems change. So when we talk about getting more supports into schools, more counselors, I want to know what kind of training is happening and how are the identities of young people being represented or at least honored and acknowledged by their school support staff. Because when it comes to LGBTQ plus students, when it comes to queer students, they tell us that they're afraid of being judged and misunderstood by school staff. So that's already happening with the supports in place. So if we're adding, peer-to-peer supports, or if we're adding school counselors, how are those peer-to-peer support programs honoring the multiple identities that young people hold? How are those school counselors really acknowledging and signaling, hey, I am safe, and here's why. I'm not going to out you to a family member before you've done that conversation yourself. How are they going to signal, yeah, this is National Coming Out Day, for example, that just happened. Here's a way that they're going to really celebrate that in the school. The ways that it's not just, well, we put more people in, check. We trained young people, check. But again, it's a systems approach. How is that training happening? How are the multiplicity of identities being honored and celebrated and recognized?
I think that is so important. And you talked about this sense of belonging. And, we do a lot of work in workplaces and spend a lot of time where that has been very much a cultural buzzword in DEI work for workplaces. And, that is bigger than diversity. It's bigger than inclusion. It is this sense that you actually do belong here. You have a place here and you are valued here. This report actually extends that concept to schools in kind of a broader way than I think I've seen before. And it has 3 specific steps: that students are noticed, students are named, and students are known. And I thought, particularly as you were talking about the ways we can interact with youth, as we look at some of the challenges that are out there, some of the pushback that we've gotten, the changes to curriculum, changes to services, that seems really difficult. But can you talk about how those 3 steps actually do create a space in which a young person can thrive?
Yeah, you set it up well. So notice, named, known. Surprisingly, even though you're in school where attendance is happening, a lot of young people are telling us, I'm not noticed, I'm not named. Or, maybe my name is mispronounced or forgotten. So how can they feel known? How can they feel that sense of belonging and safety and inclusion in their school if they're not even being acknowledged on a basic level? So this goes into naming students, is also maybe knowing their pronouns, honoring their pronouns. That's part of naming someone, right? And LGBTQ plus students, our research shows that they're more motivated than their straight peers to do better work when adults at school are openly supportive, which is exciting, right? Like that's an amazing opportunity to support queer young people, to say, like, I know you. I want to honor who you are and the identities that you hold. And I notice you. I name you fully. And so that building block really gets you to a place of belonging, where you're like, this teacher gets me. Maybe you don't have the trusted adults in other places, but that classroom during 7th period is going to be a place where you are known, and where who you are is celebrated and received with a lot of respect and warmth. So if we know that LGBTQ plus students are significantly already more lonely at school, they're significantly feeling less safe at school compared to their straight peers, then they're feeling unnamed, they're feeling unseen. So how do we change this?
Yeah. And I think I think you talked about, you wanted research to be actionable. And I think that model so puts it into action, and it so starts creating a framework for people to move forward. And it makes me think of, there's this statistic from Trevor Project's research that said that young people who had one supportive adult in their life were 40% less likely to attempt suicide in the last year than those who said they had no one. Yes. It's that one adult, that teacher in 7th period, the classroom where, you can go to, it makes that much of a difference. It's really profound. I want to acknowledge that I got very excited looking at your research in how it was done and how the data was collected and what questions were asked. We are asked to look at a lot of research, and I find that I send a lot of emails back saying, why did you only collect gender information in a binary manner? Could you talk, because this was not the case in this. It was very, very inclusive. You went across sexual orientation, gender identity. You went into race too. What was the thought process that got you there? Because so many researchers don't take that time. Could you talk to people about that?
Yeah, I'm so glad you noticed that and are affirming that alongside of us. It really is our mission to understand all young people, to see all young people flourish. So if we want to have that for all young people, then we also have to understand the particularity of different young people. We can't just give a big summary of the majority. We need to understand the nuances and the specificity of different young people. And that's really, it just comes down to our commitment as a research institute. So especially if someone's marginalized, if there's a young person who's being excluded or not acknowledged in some way, well, what is it about their experience that we need to understand better to reflect back to institutions and trusted adults so that they can notice, name, know that young person in their particularity. It's just that identities are critical, period, but especially Gen Z tells us and shows us over and over again that it's important to them that their identities that they hold, that they're acknowledged and honored.
And I think it's so important to see that kind of research coming out of organizations that are not primarily LGBTQ focused.
Sure.
I think it, first of all, it really emphasizes that people are being seen and that the research community is taking this very seriously. But I think it also gives us working in this space more evidence to say, listen, we're not the only ones saying this. Even researchers in other places focused on other issues are collecting this. So thank you for that. Could you talk a little bit about some of the findings that you did find, especially as it was looking at non-binary students? Because I noticed that pretty much consistently through the report, their experiences were worse in most cases than their binary counterparts. Can you talk a little about it?
Yeah, and that's why they were drawn out, because there was a distinction between different gender identities. So you already said a great one at the top, but another one is that just 48% of non-binary students agree my school helps people like me succeed, whereas female identified and male identified are in the 70s percent for that. So that's a significant disparity. 51% of non-binary students agree most adults at my school are openly supportive of me. So the other half aren't feeling supported by the adults at their school, whether that's school staff, whether that's teachers, whether that's administrators. And then 38% of all students, so this is a stat that's encompassing everyone who took our surveys, say it's very important to them that adults at my school acknowledge my identity. So just driving home that point again, that Gen Z cares deeply about this. And so we want our research to show that we're listening well and reflecting back what they're telling us.
Yeah, and I think it's important to have those numbers. It is also important to collect the narratives, many of which are in there, and I think is so important. I also think that it creates a template and a path forward for educators too, because we know that educators are being asked to handle a lot of things. They are not always being provided with training that is responsive to what is going on there. And I think this kind of research really makes the case for it in a much bigger way than we've seen before. You also did data, and I mentioned this, broken out by race, racial or ethnic identity. Could you talk a little bit about what the findings were there? I think people probably know that they tended to skew less positively, but was there anything that really jumped out for you?
Yeah, I mean, BIPOC, so Black, Indigenous, people of color students, they overall have expressed higher levels of loneliness, less feelings of safety at their school. They're more likely to be afraid of judgment at school. But there are some they might be surprising to some people, some differences too, is that BIPOC students, as well as their white peers, are just as likely to not trust school counselors. There isn't a disparity there. It's really just that both groups, in this case, BIPOC students, white students, are saying that the current resources in their schools they're not sufficient. And so there isn't one identity in terms of ethnicity that's saying that more than the other, except there is noticeable differences in our research for American Indian students who experience exceptionally higher levels of distrust than any other group, and exceptionally lower feelings of safety when it came to expressing their own identities at school and feeling like safety to share real aspects of their lives with staff at school. So yeah, it's just that there's overall, I think it's surprising maybe that there's similar distrust, similar distancing of some of the resources and supports.
Thank you. We're getting close on time, and there's two more things that I want to make sure that I ask you. One of the pieces that I found really interesting, and this might have been because I was the student who made herself sick over her grades, was the importance of expectation alignment in these conversations. Could you explain briefly what that is and how that comes into this conversation?
The three driving themes in our mental health research are connections, expectations, and purpose. So expectations, we want to understand how can those be both helpful and harmful when it comes to mental health. So there's a really cool closer look in this report from one of our research advisors who's a developmental psychologist at Northwestern. Her name's Dr. Ani Rogers. And she talks about her own classroom where she had students dropping her course because they were so focused on achieving and competition and meeting this really high expectation of what an ideal student must do. And it's really about grades. It wasn't about even necessarily absorbing the content or connecting with the material and one another. So she dramatically re-altered her classroom setting. It's a really poignant and helpful example because it shows that real changes can happen in classrooms and in institutions to where, you know, I'll just read a sentence from her own writing. She said, in restructuring my course, I aim to cultivate a learning space centered on relationships, curiosity, equity, and discovery. I replaced all exams with applied assignments where students use developmental theory for tasks. She goes on to describe what that was, but she ultimately says she opens space for students to choose topics and conduct their own research. So she's like, let's really get into the material here instead of competing with one another and just so worried about our grade. That level of expectations was harming students' mental health. And so she said, let me really be an educator here and think about what will be most effective, even just to absorb the content. And she's heard back over and over again from her students how much they really feel like they're in the course for what the course's intention is, rather than just seeing this high level of achievement. So that's one example of expectations. But we really hope all different institutions and educators reading this will examine their own practices as well.
Yeah, I just love that because I think, you know, as we understand that people learn differently, people express themselves differently, this just opened up the conversation, and that particular narrative really, really fascinated me. So we have about 2 minutes left, and I want to make sure that we get people set up to do things next. So first, could you let people know a little bit more about how to find more about Springtide and maybe some of the stuff that's coming up? And do you have any suggestions for people who are listening to this and want to do something with the information?
We're so excited that folks are maybe hearing about us for the first time today. You can find all of our research and resources on springtideresearch.org. You can find us on social media at We Are Springtide. But I want to specifically highlight this resource because we're talking about what educators can do, but maybe you're not an educator. This A Guide to Turn the Tide is a really quick, easy resource that goes along with the report, but it has all these different questions that you can use for your own introspection, whether you're conducting groups, whether you're working one-on-one with young people. There's just a lot of space for reflection where you could take these as actual conversation starters to understand what the young people in your own circles of influence are experiencing, or you could quote young people themselves back to other young people where, you know, we have a lot of quotes from other Gen Zers and say, is this indicative of your experience? Why or why not?
I love that. Thank you, Marta. Thank you so much. And thank you to everybody at Springtide Research. This is just a really great report. I think it turns a lot of things on its head in a good way for people. And we really appreciate you. Please, if you have some new stuff, we would love for you to come back and talk a little bit more about it. But thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, PFLAG. We're so grateful to be in conversation and for all the work you do.
Thank you so much. Well, everybody, that's the end of another show. Please check out that research. It is really fantastic stuff. And check out that action guide, the guide to turning the tide. I love that. We will be back next week with another show for you. In the meantime, if you need any support, make sure you visit us at pflag.org to locate your nearest chapter or to download some free resources. We wrap up the same way every single week by reminding you to run fast, laugh hard, and most of all, be kind. We'll see you next week on Something to Talk About Live. Thanks, everyone.